I actually haven't given this lecture in a long time. I'm kind of looking forward to it. When we were developing this conference here, we decided that, when I first got down here, we had a lot of new growers on the scene, and I was doing a lot of that, learning from the growers who've been in it for a while, passing that along to the new growers, and we've been getting where we've just been addressing the growers who've been in this for a while. So we want to take a step back. We've got some new growers interested again. Let's take a step back and review the sort of couple of things, the fertility one and the weeds, the other one, those being the two key things that are going to be the most trouble for new organic growers into this. Now that said, there's some very experienced growers here in the audience, so if you have some opinions or some new experiences you want to relate to the audience here today with some of these principles, then please feel free. The first thing to talk about, and this is sometimes something that new growers are not very familiar with, is the blind cultivation part of the weed management. And I actually say the battle is really won or lost right here in the blind cultivation portion of this. And folks are first interested in getting some fancy setups here for the between row cultivation. But I say actually you need to focus on this blind row cultivation first and foremost. Now what do I mean by blind cultivation? We've got a couple different implements that I call a blind cultivator. And a blind cultivator is something where I'm going to set that cultivator and I'm not going to worry about where the implement, where that steel is in relation to my grow. So, I always tell the growers, this is something you can put your teenager on out there. I mean, we don't have a lot of precision. Just don't drive tractor tires across the crop. We're good. The Rotary Hoe is the most popular across much of our soil types. So and folks are more familiar with the Rotary Hoe. These were used for many years in cotton production here in North Carolina. They weren't used for weed control. They were used for busting up the surface layer of crust to allow a cotton seed to come on through the soil. Well, what we're using it for in this situation, let me show you another device that's doing the same thing, really, but has a little different skill set doing it, is the Flex-Tine harrow. And again, I think this is delusional. They actually have these things come so that you try to set up different spring tensions for on top of your crop row, between your crop row, and that doesn't really pan out in my experience. I think we set them all to the same thing and we drive across our field. And we can drive fast. I don't think one of our growers is here. He tells me he cultivates with his Flex-Tine and with his Rotary Hoe 12 miles an hour. So he's in the zone when he's out there with those harrows. What are you after when you're out there with these blind cultivators? We are after tiny weeds. I always say, if you can see the weed while you're sitting up in your tractor, you know that's the weed you're missing with your blind cultivation paths. You are after tiny weeds. These are weeds that are missed by blind cultivation. So that tells you the first principle of blind cultivation is frequency. For corn and soybeans, we're hitting the crop about every 5 days with these blind cultivators. I have seen up to 4 and 5 blind cultivations on both corn and soybeans used. I've seen sometimes 2, but it's a wide range. But people try to hit it with the blind cultivator just as often as they can, for as long as they can, until the crop is too big. We're starting to do damage with it. Now, the cultivators, I want to go back and look at these pictures. They vary a bit by soil and their action, so there is some subtle distinctions between these two devices. Rotary hoes on the deep, fluffy blackland soils will have a tendency to want to dig themselves in and do a little excavation work for you. So some of the heaviest organic matter soils, up over 15%, I've noticed that nobody's using a Rotary Hoe under those conditions, and they'll go to Flex-Tine only. I've also found that the Flex-Tines, watching them walk through the field, Darren Huber's was watching his, it's very aggressive to go to Flex-Tine harrow on those high organic matter soils. And so it has a crooked end down here, and he actually cut all those off and just went with a straight. So there's some subtlety that you want to mess around with on soil type. And we just can't give you one prescription for your soil type. So that's where, as a new grower, you really want to practice around with these devices. The Flex-Tine in general, I find, is more aggressive. And but it has one thing it will not do. If you're back here on a coastal plain soil that has a crust forming, there will be days you cannot get a Flex-Tine harrow on the ground and do anything with it because you're too crusted to get it in there. And so I've seen growers take a Rotary Hoe out, Rotary Hoe, and then come in with a Flex-Tine harrow and do a couple passes that way and do a much better job on their weed cleanup. The Flex-Tine harrow also is amazingly good at finding those corn roots. If you look at the beginning of the corn rooting system, when it sends out those roots that start going a little crooked there, that flex-tine harrow can hook on one of those and pull it out of the ground. So when you start seeing too many of them fly back in, it's time to switch over to the rotary hoe or lay off and go to just between row cultivation on the corn. I will oftentimes see more flex-tine harrow passes on a soybean crop than you will see on a corn crop. Any questions about that? I'm whirling through that part of the thing, but that actually is the biggest key. The weeds, I mentioned the size that you're after, but the location you're actually after as well is, let's go back to this one here. What weeds are really after? This thing is covering, all these things are covering all the fields. So I am covering and getting rid of weeds both very near the row and between the row uniformly. But I actually don't even care if I'm taking weeds out between the row. I got plenty of kinds of steel that I can take that out with afterwards. My goal is to take out all these weeds that are very near the crop row because I don't have any other way to control them, by and large, later in the season. So that's what my interest is. Now, in corn, we have a little more flex because I have seen years when we lost a little near-row weed control, and we were worried about our corn, and people put the shovels on their between-row cultivator, and they'll come and just bury that corn crop. I like to tell the story of Ted Birch in Duplin County, and he didn't get any blind row cultivation done out there because of labor issues, and he likes me to share the story, so pass it along. And he just came in and he buried that corn. It must have been 18 inches of soil, just piled up, and you had ears sticking up under there. And he got a nice yield out of that. So we have some flex from corn. Now, how well does that work in soybean? We're starting to set our yield at like this, so we can't throw hardly any dirt to soybean, maybe a little. So that's the one. Finally, if we miss blind row cultivations at the beginning of the season because it's a wet spring, and you get delayed on, that first or second pass, you can walk into those fields at 2 weeks after planting and be like, well, this is probably a loss. You can try to salve it, but you're looking at a lot of tiny little weeds that are going to be with you in November. And so, in fact, I have a professor at NC State, Harold Coble, who's weed scientist, was for many years. And he came from the day when we were doing this all originally, and he said on his farm, they would if they got the first 2 passes with a rotary hoe on their soybeans, and they would look at the weather forecast, they would wait for a nice window when they could plant to moisture and get those first two passes out. And if they got that, they knew that was a grain soybean. If they missed that, then they knew that they were going to harvest that for hay.
What's your percentage of loss with either of these?
Great question, Brian. You always like to trade some tricky questions for me. I'd say because people are running their cultivators a little different. Even with a rotary hoe, I'm going to vary my depth a little bit with pressure and stuff. And by the time you interact that with your soil type, I can only give you a pretty wide range, and it's between 5 and 20% by the time you add up all your blind cultivation passes on both corn and soybeans, roughly. And so I always encourage people just to go and eyeball it every once in a while and see how it's working on your soil and bump up your seeding rates accordingly. Now in soybean, we'll get to that a little bit, we have such wide flexibility in our seeding rate, there's no reason not to really bump up that seeding rate. On corn, that's where you really want to pay attention because you can get too much corn population out there and be in trouble.
When's your first cultivation?
Okay, so the schedule for corn and soybeans is they try to plant, and then they want to get blind cultivation pass right before the crop pops up out of the ground. So, for soybeans, we're trying to get it in 4 or 5 days after they planted. Corn's a little cooler that time of year, maybe a week, or right before it pops on through. The soybean goes through a phase, right as it pops up out of the ground, it's crooked like that, and if you hit it then, you'll snap all the little stems right there. So you have to wait till it just barely stands up straight, and then you can start hitting it again. And that usually, if you've got you plant into moisture, and that happens quickly and uniformly, that first pass might be 5 days after planting. That next one can really be 5 days after that last one as well, as long as you've got it quickly. The one time we have trouble with that, if we didn't plant to moisture and you get in sort of an erratic emergence, then we got decision time here to make. We have seen that. We also plant to the dry quite often because we have to go and plant everywhere, and so sometimes we end up with erratic stands because of that we have to figure out how to cultivate. Now, I say all this, we've done a little bit of work looking at blind cultivation. This is back when I first got here, we did this work on looking at blind cultivation. We appear to be, by hitting it, many times, we do lose a little potential yield out of that process by, go figure, beat the heck out of the plant repeatedly. This isn't the best of things. So we did this test under various weedy conditions. Here we had no weeds to speak of at all in Plymouth, and you can just see sort of a gradual decline in yields because of that. It's not a massive decline, and all things organic, it's not probably our biggest thing to fret about in the world, but we see that under weedier conditions a little bit as well, potential yield. But if you can't run the combine through the field, you lose all of yield, and so I don't really see this yet. We'd like to figure out other methods of weed control that didn't do that, but oftentimes 2 blind passes or 2 blind cultivations are not enough, and so we don't discourage the repeated cultivations to keep it clean enough to harvest. Between row cultivators, and again, like I said, this is hard to oftentimes start thinking about that. I don't think that's necessarily where to start. But we've got so many different options, but I just want to show you the options that I most often see. These S-tine cultivators are certainly the most popular. They're usually marketed under a Danish tine cultivator. Most growers have a Danish tine cultivator and a rolling cultivator, and those are the 2 between row implements that they're using. They have a weird, this classic C-shank, which is an older design. They're a little more rugged for slightly larger weeds. These can't handle too big of weeds. But they do a really nice, thorough job. They vibrate a little bit as they move through the soil, and they're quick as well. And so it tends to be the most preferred. I call this a high residue cultivator, and most of the books do as well. A number of growers will call it rescue cultivator. And it's because even in the conventional world, sometimes growers will have one of these if they have a field for which they have lost control of the weeds for some reason, and we've let things get very large. This is a cultivator that can come in and deal with larger weeds. In fact, it's quite opposite. Most cultivation equipment does a much better job the smaller the weed. A high residue cultivator actually works better the larger the weed. And the reason is because we use them, they'll run a sweep perfectly flat with the ground. They run underneath and sort of cut and sever everything from the roots. If you have a small weed and you have moisture afterwards, that thing just basically replants itself. If you have a pigweed that's up that big, it cannot replant itself. You sever all of its roots on a nice warm sunny day. It doesn't take very long for the whole thing to just heal on over. So they are nice as a rescue operation. They take a lot of horsepower, so oftentimes growers will have this, we have growers that are cultivating 14, 16 rows at a time at this point, the Danish tines and the rolling cultivators. But you wouldn't want to have that in this. You couldn't pull it, so you might have this down at much fewer rows if you need to come in and rescue something. I've been interested in them. We've been playing around with them in our no-till system, so we'll talk about that later. But they do have a role to play. Also, these are available, oftentimes very inexpensive in 4-row models at the auctions right now. Tobacco folks use these all the time for hilling. You can actually change how the cultivator works, and you can point it straight down and put ridging wings on it and pull up a big hill. And so they're pretty widely available at the auctions. And KMC makes them as well. The rolling cultivator. Now there is artistry to rolling cultivator, and so if I have folks that have other ways of using them, please just let us know about it, because there's a huge range of things that you can do with rolling cultivator. And sometimes growers will have multiple rolling cultivators set up in different styles of cultivating, actually, because they're kind of a pain to mess around with all the angles. But we can use them to peel dirt away from a crop row. We can use it to throw dirt towards a crop row. We can use it more just for between row without throwing a whole lot of dirt one way or the other. We've been toying around just this last summer with, we've got a little, what they call a split row gang mounted on irons up front. And what that does is it rides real close to the crop row early in the season, so I can just as close, we don't have any other device that can get as close as that will. And and that'll peel a little dirt back off of the crop row. And then we've got the rear gangs angled, so they'll pick up that dirt that got peeled off and then start throwing it a little bit back up towards the crop row. And everything, all that clean row weeds got cleaned out, but also moved dirt around that was very close to the crop row. Sometimes folks will then disengage that splitter once the crop gets a little more advanced and just use the rear gangs. Does that make sense? Now, seeding rate is, so, all right, so the big gun that we have in this whole thing is the cultivation, and that is the part that we have to learn up front. But I'm going to go through the other host of agronomic things that we can do, cultural practices, so we can try to adjust our weed competitiveness on that. For seeding rate is certainly a big one that we use in some species more than others, and we're just trying to get an earlier crop closure. And in some crops, it's very safe to a point to do this. And so, at our seed cost relative to the entire structure of most of the organic food crop, field crops, seed is relatively inexpensive part of the whole package. And so, why not throw more seed at the issue versus anything else that we could do? This is sort of just an idealized drawing, not based on data, but sort of the textbook type of drawing we like to think about. That we classify crops like corn, a non-tillering, a non-branching type of crop, being very sensitive to the correct seeding rate. If you plant too much corn and you don't have enough rain to support that corn, your yield drops off in a hurry. So we have limited flex for what we can do with that. Well, we have tillering crops like wheat, where we have a very wide plateau. I probably actually drew that not as flat as it should be. It's really something like wheat. It's very flat for a long, long ways. You could have 100 pounds of wheat seed and you have 200 pounds of wheat seed and you come up with the same darn yield out of that. So you have a very flexible format for that crop. Soybean is very similar to wheat in that way. It doesn't tiller, but it has such a branching ability that we have a very wide plateau. So our soybean specialist, Jim Duncan on campus, likes to talk about in the Roundup Ready technology that seeds so very expensive. How low can you go is their motto. How few seed can we get out there and get the yield that we need? Organically, we want to think about how high can we stand. Because the only negative from having too much seed out there, other than it being a little more money, is that it can lead to lodging if we go too high. So how far can you push that before the crop flops over? And really you can push it a long ways. And actually, if folks remember about what kind of soybean seeding rates we were using 30 years ago, they were really a lot higher than what we use today. So 75,000 would not be uncommon for many conventional growers to plant. And here we are, we pushed it all the way up to 225,000. And actually, under conventional tillage, cultivation appears to have a little ability to make the crop stand up a little better. So just this year, we've seen it again where herbicide systems, we had this experimental design, and the herbicide crops were more prone to lodging hurricane we had than the stuff that we cultivated. So we can really push. We haven't seen the 225,000 plants per acre. We have not seen that fall over with cultivation yet. That's a lot of plants. And the ability to control weeds is pretty substantial, as you can see. It's dead. I just like to show that graph. This is the prettiest one I have. The number of pigweeds being controlled by increased seeding rates. I'll mention this one because I get asked about it repeatedly, but we do not see it used here. And I think I get asked about it repeatedly because it's in a lot of extension bulletins out of the Midwest for organic grains. Using a stale seedbed approach. And what they do there is they will completely prepare the ground for planting. So you've got all your leveling passes done, you're ready to put the planter in the ground, and then they let it sit there for another week or two. They let the weeds come on, and then they come through with another very short, shallow pass to clean out the weed seeds that germinated in that top little bit of soil. So most of the weed seeds that are growing up in your crops are germinating out of the top quarter-inch of soil. It's very shallow. Weed seeds are very small. So we're not germinating things down below, and the approach is to try to clean out that top quarter-inch of soil as much as you can. So you want to shallowly cultivate that without bringing up new weed seeds and then plant your crop. a little dead zone is what you're basically trying to do. It's very effective in particular with a flamer. So folks will come in and flame.
Yes, I'm not here to see somebody say, and
Yes, you can flame weeds. You cannot burn crop residues.
Oh, well, I was asking
You're allowed to flame. This would be, you've already prepared your field, so it's bare ground of residue at that point. And so you are allowed to pass propane flamers over the top of it and do that. So, I should mention there are two flamings. This style uses the broadcast flamer, so it's a very quick pass with low-level heat across the surface of the soil. The other flamer that used historically here in the southeast was a flamer that went down the crop row and actually pointed in and burned the bottom of the crop stem and then burned the weeds out that were growing near the crop stem. So haven't seen a lot of that. Another one that, but there's a very different approach, and this is confusing, but what they're trying to do is very different with this fallow flushing approach. And there what they're trying to do is clean the entire weed seed bank somehow. So they're trying to incorporate into their crop rotation some mechanism to not clean out that top quarter inch for that crop that's growing right now. They're trying to clean out a whole 6 inches of what we call the seed bank. That entire area, they're trying to figure out a way with rotation to actually clean some of that seed out. And the way they do that is incorporate in their rotation a time at which they can stir the soil periodically. So they might do this for a month, 2 months, in between cover crops, in between cash crops, clean periodically, and then go back into cash crops. It's been super effective in a handful of pit situations. We haven't seen that here in the organic grain crops, but again, I've gotten asked about it a couple of times. We have a farm, there's a famous study, I think it's why, it's been written up by a lot of extension up in Pennsylvania, of a farm almost completely eliminated weeds. They can basically go and till the soil and they can watch, the scientists can sit there and watch, and nothing comes up. And they just don't have any weed seeds left in their soil structure. But they pursued a strategy like this for 15 years, so it was a long-term endeavor. Now this is something we are doing more with, seeding pattern. So the wheat would be one that's very amenable to this. 7.5-inch rows, which may seem very tight, is still from a weed control point of view not ideal. And so there's two mechanisms to achieve a better pattern for controlling weeds. One is to drill your field twice. So what a grower will do is they'll come in and plant once, and they'll come in at a slight angle to that first one and cross-drill that. Now, if you have big square fields, I want to emphasize that they're at a slight angle. Because if you ever try riding over your tire tracks at a right angle, you're going to beat yourself half to death. They come in at a slight angle and cross-drill that. Broadcast seeding, which comes in and out of favor in the conventional wheat world, is more common in organic wheat production, say, as well. So we're just preparing the soil, we're broadcasting the seed, and we're using some type of light rake or light tillage implement to incorporate that seed lightly. And that achieves a much better seeding pattern. It also allows us to plant a lot of seed. So you can see growers, really get up there. I think 176 pounds is what one of our growers says he likes to plant. I'm not sure what 76, but anyway, they get up there on their seeding rates.
I understand that the broadcast seeding and the heavier seeding rate to turn the weeds, but as John's pointed out, I'm stunned by the lack of ability to later and side dressing.
Well, you can't side dress wheat anyway. So wheat is just too tight a crop. Once it's in the ground, you're top dressing. There's no way to side dress anything like that. No. The only thing we could conceive of side dressing would be corn, but we would have to, we have equipment issues even when we're trying to figure out how to side dress corn. Oh, sorry, the question was about side dressing wheat.
What is the cost analysis of an increase in the seeding rate?
Well, yeah, and that gets us into an awkward issue, us versus the Midwest right now. Our wheat and our soybean seed, we are using, as you all know, we're not using organic seed on those right now. We're using untreated conventional seed because most of our varieties are not available that we need organically. So we're in this rare situation where the seed is cheaper than the stuff coming out the combine and going to the grain purchasers at the end of the day. So it really pencils out very, very well for us. You know, like imagine a bag of seed for soybeans right now, which we might pay $20 for, maybe $25 for that seed. We can get almost that for the, so anyway, it's not very well. Now, if we go to organic seed, it still probably pencils out. Crop rotation, now, for organics, we've been trying to emphasize lengthening rotations wherever we can. We have some restrictions on our markets of how well we've been able to do that. We think it is a great panacea for many insects, for many diseases. A lot of rotation strategies don't do anything for us on weeds. So alternating between corn and soybeans, I don't think buys you practically anything. We have about the same sets of species that do well in them with some minor differences. The only crop rotation that really helps us in the weed control world is going between an annual and a perennial system. So we've got a dairy farmer who's growing a lot of row crops, and he's able to alternate his hay fields with his row crops. And you can see a big difference in that. When they break that hay land again and go back to the row crop production, you're able to start at a much cleaner spot. A lot of our grain farmers, we just don't have that option. So, but I pointed out, because some of you may have that option, I get this question sometimes about soybeans, in particular when we've lost control of weeds in a soybean and we've set a lot of seed in that field. What's the best option to do? Now, actually, after talking to you, John, last night, I should mention that one. We have some growers who are setting their combines to actually take the weed seed out of the field. So they're not trying to separate it by the combine. So they're taking weed seed and crop out, and then they clean the crop outside of it and dump the weed seed. So actually, I had that happen in Maine when I was up there as well. He kept trying to sell me this organic bird food, and I figured out it was his weed seeds coming out of his field. And I think that is a valid, you do take enough out for that to matter. So the other thing, there's been a little shift in thinking about some of this. You really have two approaches, and a disc isn't involved in either one. I think you're better off to either leave the weed seed exposed to predation over the whole fall and winter, or moldboard plow, but do not disc. So leaving it out there, the reason for the change is the amount of weed seed predation that goes on most farm fields wasn't previously appreciated, but there's a lot of critters out there that eat weed seeds. So if we leave it out there, we're able to get rid of a lot more of it than we originally thought. Moldboard plowing, what is that buying us? Some people think it's just sort of, putting lipstick on a pig, but it is a strategy that can be employed occasionally. If you did it too often, of course, if we were to moldboard plow the very next year, you're going to bring back up those weed seeds that you just buried. But if you can moldboard plow and then not come back to a moldboard plow for a while, and your system allows you to do that, then leaving seeds down there for a couple of years can actually buy you a lot of seed down. Weed seeds do die in the soil. And I think that's the other change. We oversold the story for a long time that weed seeds just exist in the seed bank for generations, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Some species are longer lived, but a lot of the worst ones in agriculture are not longer lived. Secondly, it's a small fraction of the population that's actually able to live that long, and that's what matters. In this study, we had red root pigweed, which I think of as probably the worst weed that we have on most organic grain farms. After a year and a half, we only got a quarter of it left. Now, that's still a lot of weed, right? But still, that matters. Losing a quarter matters. There's been some interesting work where the effectiveness of blind cultivation actually matters how much weed seed you start with. If you have a ton of weed seeds flushing at the same time, Rotary Hoe has a harder time pulling them up out of the ground because they're all sort of locked in there together and they stabilize each other. So cutting your population does matter. Even a couple of years of having your problem buried by moldboard plow or buried by a pasture or a hayfield does matter for the long-term trajectory of your weed seed bank. And I will say that we have seen this type of thinking for folks who've been in this for a few years is worth thinking about, because we've had some growers' fields that, you know, after 4 or 5 years, the weed seed bank was just over the top. And so what mechanisms do we have to reset that and bring it back down for a little while? Now, this is where I would love to be able to do more. There is a big nutrient placement effect on wheat competition. That's one of the reasons we got into banning fertilizer. If we can ban the fertilizer near the crop row, we are able to advantage the crop over the weed. But that has been the problem in organics, is we haven't had a lot of mechanisms for banning that. We have some manure injection systems being tested around now. Up in New England, they have a lot of the liquid manure injection systems, so there's some possibilities there, but we haven't been able to take full advantage of that like we would like. Okay, varietal selection, and that I mentioned before when I presented the variety trials that we do on wheat, corn, and soybeans. One of the things we're looking at is organic rank the treatments different, rank the varieties differently than conventional, and weed pressure is probably the primary thing that we would worry about in a lot of those cases as to what might shift those ranks. One of the things that folks used to say we were looking for is taller varieties on this. Wheat, for instance, has become a lot shorter over time, and so maybe we want to go back to some of the taller weeds. I can tell you in soybeans, when we've looked at the height issue, it did not matter at all. I've tested 7, 8 foot tall forage type soybeans that do terrible in weed control trials, and had some very short soybeans that did very well. And so in the case of soybeans, what we wanted was something that came out of the ground really quick, got its leaves out there, and started competing with staples very fast. Whether it got to 7 foot tall in August did not matter at all. It's what it did at the beginning of the season that mattered. So I suspect it's the same case with wheat, but we don't have the data on that yet. And there's just some pictures of the way we studied that in soybeans, and taking pictures of. Many of you know George. He left me his catalog of 30,000 pictures of soybeans early in the season. It's a real crowd pleaser. But there is quite a bit of variation in how varieties come out of the ground at the beginning of the season. Now, NRCS isn't here at the lecture today, so they don't have to have heartburn for all the cultivation talk I just did. But we have been trying to figure out how to reduce all this cultivation, all this tillage that's been going on in organics. And Julie mentioned the work that's been going on in corn. We've been doing quite a bit of this with soybean as well. And so my conclusions on soybeans are just summarized here quickly. Now, I would say for the experienced grower, this is something to wade into slowly and try it out. You might want to go try it on a 20-acre plot. For the grower new to organics, it's something you could experiment with right up front, but again, to go very slowly. I would not start your whole acreage in your organic program centered around, oh, I'm going to do it this way, because I think that would be a very, very poor idea. So the system we've got for soybean, we come in and we plant a cover crop in the fall of rye, and we plant that rye cover crop with complete tillage. Nobody thinks that we're going to have an organic system with no tillage ever in the cycle. The question is, how do we reduce it? Where do we put that tillage in the system? Why do we think we can do this organics? Because I think the perennial weeds will eat us alive. We have to have an answer for the nut sedges and the Johnson grasses of this world. And it's kind of interesting. If we look around at organic farms, some of my colleagues said, oh, you're going to have convolvulus perennials. We do not have Johnson grass and nut sedge problems on our organic farms. Nobody ever asked me about what to do about those things. Why? Because we're cultivating the heck out of everything. The perennials go away. Annual grasses, annual broadleaves, that's what we're fighting. So now we're going to go to a system, though, where we advocate this. This actually will push us back towards the perennials. You would not want to do too much of it in your rotation. It has to be used with complete tillage, alternating back and forth in my mind. Now the advantage of this system is where are we going to put the tillage? We're going to put the tillage in the fall instead of in the spring. And this is the part I think NRCS gets excited about. Because in the fall, I plant a cover crop with a grain drill. I'm putting it into a warm soil. I'm putting it out there at 7.5 inches. So by the time, from the time I start tilling to the time I have complete ground cover, can be just weeks long. And compare that to what's going on in corn and soybeans with conventional tillage. I'm going to start tilling my corn land in March. I'm going to continue cultivating it and rotary hoeing it, and between row cultivating, I don't have soil coverage by the corn canopy until when? Like June. So from a soil conservation point of view, that's where the problem is. So we're going to shift our tillage into the fall, get our ground cover back up there with the cover crop. So soil conservation, great. Environmental services, great. Well, what does it mean for the growers? I mentioned before that the soybeans, if I miss some rotary hoeings, even though I'm doing all that cultivation, I can still end up with a weedy mess at the end of the day. And that's been the real frustration with soybeans. Here, what am I doing? I'm planting my cover crop up in the fall, I'm coming through and I'm mashing it down with my roller, I'm planting my soybean, and I go on summer vacation. I mean, I don't have anything else that I'm going to do to that field. And so that's the attraction of it. From a management, from a cost input structure, this system, hands down, is better, if it works, than what we're currently doing on organic soybeans. So does it work? Almost perfectly, but not quite. We got a big problem. I'll come to that in a second. So, does it work in terms of weed control? Yes. Are weed control out of the system hands down better than what on average I'm seeing on farms? Now you can say it's better than what I do on organic cultivation work, but maybe that's not the high water mark of weed control. But it's better than what I see our growers doing, and they would agree with that when we've had the field tours. So better on weed control, as long as I've grown enough rye. We have varied the amount of rye out there inadvertently by the way we managed our rye cover crop over the years. And if we have very little rye, this doesn't work. If we have a medium amount of rye, it works about half the time. I'd say that worked, that didn't work. If I have a lot of rye out there, this works flawlessly in terms of weed control. Yeah.
This might be a different question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Is it possible that a grower would plant rye as a cover crop and maybe it's too wet for them to get in and plant their soybeans, and so they decide to let it? Can that then be, let's say that will go to seed because we have a market for it, for rye? I mean, would that be a good alternative to that grower instead of, I mean, did that happen on that end of the area that they have?
I mean, we haven't had much of a market for rye. The question is could we harvest the rye with a rare situation, in which case we say, hey, wait a second, instead of going this no-till soybean system, we're going to go and harvest a rye and do that. If we had a market for rye, it certainly could be, and then what we would do is do the way that we double crop soybeans when we have a small grain out there, and rye comes at the same time as wheat, because we would harvest it. Now, you're not going to have enough biomass to do no-till. So then you would harvest it, you would moldboard plow here, all that residue under, and then go to a clean tilt system.
Even if the grower cut high?
Yeah, you're not going to, you're not going to get a nice mulch out of that. But that's okay. I mean, that's the way we're doing wheat now. When we double crop, and we're probably double cropping wheat with soybeans, probably a third of the time that we grow soybeans, they're double cropped after a wheat crop. Then that's what they're doing, is they're coming in moldboard plowing. Now, they're moldboard plowing because, you're going to run all that cultivation equipment. You can't have a lot of residue hanging around to do this whole blind cultivation routine. And so they're not disking. That's about the only time they generally moldboard plow a field is when they're going to double crop. We may have a few that are doing it disc-wise, but probably most are moldboard plowing at that time. The yield that we're able to get out of this system, when we have a lot of rye biomass, we are able to get as much yield out of this as we run a check every year of where we actually use herbicides, conventional tillage, and keep it weed-free, and we're able to get the same yield out of this as we get out of that. And organic soybeans in general, because of the weed control issue, we're not getting anywhere close. And so we are able to get our yields up there. This is so 2 points I want to make with this though. This amount of rye biomass that we're growing though means that we have to treat it differently than we used to treat cover crops on the farm. So a rye cover crop in particular, we sling that out there whenever we're in the mood, and we don't worry about thinking about it a whole lot. We got to get this cover crop planted on time. Even November, this last graph I show you with the weed control, it's the same data that's generating this. We planted that rye, it wasn't that late, November 15th. I mean, we oftentimes put rye and wheat in at that time. Even that difference in some years will deprive you of the biomass you need. We really want to get that crop in October. So, and we want to make sure it has enough fertility. I think a lot of organic farmers who've been in this business for a while probably don't need to do anything to that rye cover crop because they've got enough fertility flushing through their system to fertilize that rye cover crop. If you're new and trying this out, you're going to need to fertilize that rye cover crop, which is, again, it's a transition thinking. You're going to go out there and spread for John, don't wince over there, I know. But go out there and spread manure on something that's just a cover crop. But it's not just a cover crop. It's your entire weed control package is what it is. But the other thing that we encourage our folks to do is to go and look at their fields in March and to make sure that that stand looks good. I don't even think you need to do a whole lot of sophisticated stuff out there. You know what a cover crop should look like in March. If you've got big patches that don't look like that, start disking right away. Because you've got to make the decision about whether you're going to go to this system in March. Because if you let rye go to April or May, and you've got a crop that's here, it's a little late to be thinking about disking. You're not going to make it in time to be able to have a clean enough field to then be able to cultivate. So you want to be able to go out there in March and make your decision. Unless you're at Goldsboro, in which case some crazy people ask you to disc 38 times, right? No comment back there in the back. So finally, we're able to get this yield. Well, what's the only problem that we had? I mentioned that we have a big significant problem here, is that we are finding lodging in these soybeans, and we have not been able to explain it. We've been watching it for 4 years now. And the soybeans will not lose yield to the lodging. The lodging is occurring very late in the season. But wherever we've had this rye, most of the time the soybeans fall over worse. And so it's slowing down our combine times. It slows me down on research combine, but when we've had growers do it up 20, 30 acres at a time, it's slowing them down in the field as well, combine time. And that's the big reason I'd encourage you to try it out small and see if you can live with that or not live with that until Scotty solves the darn problem. No pressure. But it is, and it's so late, like again, it's not losing yield. You've got your beans there in the field, but you can slow down to pick them. Now, if you've got pigweeds out there, you're going to go slow too. So in my mind, I'd rather combine these lodge soybeans than combine pigweedy field, but still, it's a pain in the neck. I think I'm out of time. Any questions?
I had some cover crop revealed some identified chemicals that will have a lot of weed. Now, how effective those chemicals really are on weed?
Well,
you have a field, you can have a field with a cover crop that has those chemicals, and the other half is a different cover crop that doesn't have those chemicals. Is there a very significant difference between those two?
That's a good way to put the question. And the question was, what's the role of allelopathy in these systems? And can I go out and plant, one cover crop versus another and see a big difference that we think is allelopathic? Try a wheat versus a rye. Will we see much of a difference? And the first question of what percentage of the effect might be allelopathy is very hard to experimentally determine, because really, if you think about the big effects that are out there, one, The hugest one is probably just the fact that I've got a mulch layer that thick and I got no sunshine hitting the soil surface. I got a tiny weed seed that's going to have to wind its way up through there. So just the physical obstruction and the shading, everybody's guess is that's the biggest effect. Now what's at play after that? The allelopathy versus we actually think in this system, and Scotty has some good evidence of this, that nitrogen playing a big role. I mean, when we start the soybean season, there is no nitrogen in the soil because the dry cover crop is taking it all up and is putting it up above the soil surface. And then we actually see the pigweeds that if any pigweeds are able to come through the mulch, they look terrible. The soybeans actually look terrible because the nodules don't come online for about a month. And the soybeans look peaked like they're about to kick the bucket. Their nodules come online and they green up and crumb out of it. And pigweeds oftentimes never recover from that initial nitrogen shock. So we really have a hard time apportioning out those different things. I would say anecdotally, looking at wheat versus rye, I don't see a big difference between the two of them. So now maybe it's just because wheat has just as many allelochemicals of a different kind. There's some allelochemicals that are in rye that are not in wheat and vice versa. So maybe the two of them are about equal, or maybe allelopathy isn't that big a deal. I think the jury's still out. In some species, it's been better studied and it is a big a deal. Sorghum Sudan grass has been the best researched, and there it can be really significant. In fact, you can have a plant back problem after sorghum Sudan grass. They've seen plant back issues months later with some crops after sorghum Sudan grass crop. So.
How much do you have to wait if you kill your lawn before you make them?
If you're on the coastal plain sandy soil, I would say that you need to, first of all, that's the riskiest environment to use the system. Second, I would say, is to roll and wait for a significant rain event before you plant. For the other soil types, particularly the blacklands, we're saying just same day rolling and planting is going to work out the majority of the time. You're in North Raleigh. You're on the red clay. Yeah, same day would be what I would recommend. Yep. And in fact, some growers have been putting a roller on the front of the tractor and the planter on the back and doing it in one pass.
Here's the farmer that was catching all the weed seed with his food. Is there anything to do with that weed seed, like sell it?
That's why he was trying to. The question was, is there anything we could do with weed seed if you combine it out and sort it through? Yeah. Well, he was actually shoveling it into his furnace. It burned pretty well. But no, there's not a significant market for any of this, unfortunately, other than researchers. Last question, yes. Yeah. We would presume not, from March all the way through, but it's a fairly small plant at that time. Oh, the question was, if we disked under rye in March, would we have any allelopathic effect on soybeans in May? And presumably not at all, because we have a very small plant, we have a long time between March and May. I did mention the one compound in sorghum seems to be longer acting in the soil, but the stuff in rye that's been studied, at least all the individual chemicals that have been studied, do not have a very long lifespan in the soil, so we wouldn't expect anything. All right, thank y'all very much.